Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining me once again. I'm Robert Rodriguez Jr., and I'm really excited to be presenting this second webinar in a series of free webinars covering various topics in photography that I hope you will find beneficial. As I mentioned in the first webinar a couple of weeks ago, not only do I want to address topics related to photography, but also talk about art and creativity in general, because in my experience, drawing from as many different sources as possible, not just from photography, but from all art forms, will help you to become a better, more rounded creative photographer. Today's presentation, Essentials of Composition, is basically my attempt to explain what I think are the basic principles that apply to visual composition and how you can use them to improve your photography. Composition is a very broad and vast topic with lots of different approaches and philosophies and ideas. And so I can only share one approach and one way of thinking about composition, but one that is based on first over 10 years of trying and practicing and making lots of mistakes on experience, but also based on a lot of study, a lot of research, a lot of curiosity. I've looked at and tried to understand as much as possible about composition. And so I'm going to try to share and pass that along in today's webinar. But the most important thing to remember is that this is the basics, the fundamentals. And I think that if you have the fundamentals well established, then it becomes much easier to build on that, to know when you can break the rules, so to speak. You have to understand the rules intuitively. And so the fundamentals should become second nature, because once they become second nature, then you can start to become more creative and have more fun with the creative challenge that is composition. I want to start with a quote from Charles Mingus, who is a great jazz bassist, or was a great jazz bassist. Creativity is more than just being different. Anybody can play weird. That's easy. What's hard is to be as simple as Bach. Making the simple awesomely simple, that's creativity. And I think that's really what I think about composition, which is that at its core, the essence of composition is making something that seems complex really simple to understand. That doesn't mean that you're taking away mystery or you're taking away abstraction or you're making something simpler than it needs to be. It just means making it as simple as possible, nothing more, nothing less, to bring across your message, your story, to convey what you want to convey in a photograph. That can be as complex as you want it to be, but it's the message that needs to be simple, because that's the most direct way to communicate, I think, what you want to convey in your photographs. So the basic principles that I'm going to try to address and discuss today are what I call the LCU Framework. Now, this is not something that's original. It's bits and pieces of composition that I've adapted and learned and borrowed from many different sources. But I think that this has really proven for me to be a great way to approach every single photograph. And I'll discuss what LCU means in the next slide. I also want to discuss the basics of visual design. And visual design, you can think of visual design as the grammar of composition. And just like we take words and we learn what the words mean, especially when we use them in a sentence, and the words in a sentence have different placements that affect how the sentence communicates what we want to say to a person or what we want to say when we write something. The same thing can apply to composition. And so visual design is the grammar, so to speak, of compositional design. And finally, I want to share 3 tips that you can apply right away that I think can improve your composition. Now, these 3 tips won't be 3 formulaic sort of tips. They will be things that you'll have to think about, that you'll have to apply, but I think that they will allow you to immediately begin to explore new ways to maybe get out of habits that you've fallen into with your composition, or maybe give you new ideas to explore. So let's talk about the LCU framework that I mentioned before. LCU is basically an acronym. It stands for 3 different things. L stands for lead the viewer. Another way of saying that is, where should the viewer look? And so when I make any image, I always try to apply this framework. And the first thing I ask myself is, am I leading the viewer somewhere? Am I telling them where they should look? Am I making the path that I want them to follow through the image as clear as possible? And this is important, not because you want to dictate necessarily exactly where they should look, but having a way for the viewer to flow through your image will make it easier for you to create a sense of what the image is about, establish a center of interest, which comes next, that's the C, and it also make your image much more harmonious and much more visually pleasing to look at. So if L is lead the viewer, the C stands for, are you establishing a center of interest? What should the viewer see or feel clearly? And this is equally important. You need to show the viewer what the image is about, where they should look. Now, it's important, especially with landscapes, to understand that the center of interest can be an actual subject like a rock or a tree, but it can also be a mood or a feel. It's what you're trying to convey. And often in landscape and nature photography, you're really trying to bring across a sense of the vastness of the landscape or just something about the landscape in general. That's your center of interest. And so it makes it even that much more important that you lead the viewer through this so that they really take in the whole scene instead of something being distracting, in which case you're going to fail to create or establish the center of interest. And finally, the U stands for unify the composition. Another way of saying that is, are you sure of why you are making the image? This simple question, why are you making the image, will help you to simplify and unify the composition. Another way of thinking about unity is, are all the parts of the composition in harmony? Do they all work together to make your composition as strong as possible? Now, strength in composition, that reminds me of the great Edward Weston quote, which is his definition of composition. Composition is the strongest way of seeing. And I love that quote because it is very specific. It's also very open to interpretation and open to your own creative approach. And so while it says that the composition needs to be the strongest way to see something, that's up to you to define. Now, these rules or I shouldn't say rules, these concepts here are ways to give you a framework, to give you a way to start to think about how to approach making an image. But once you learn this framework, then you're free to explore other ways and you're free to break the rules, as they say. So let's start with the first image that I want to show here. And this is a painting, actually, from one of the great Hudson River School painters, Albert Bierstadt. And I start with painting for two reasons. One, because painting and paintings, landscape paintings, are one of the ways to really learn about composition. You're learning from masters of the past. You're learning from techniques that have been applied and followed and refined over centuries. And these paintings work. They've stood the test of time. Now, if you look at this painting here, let's see if we can apply the LCU framework or see how the LCU framework is used. Number one, how is Mr. Bierstadt leading the viewer? Well, you can see here a very clear line right along this edge here between shadows and highlights. This also pulls your eye in because, again, you're being pulled along this edge towards the light. You've got a very distinct line here along the top of these cliffs. You've got a very distinct line here as well. The clouds even have some direction to them, some vectors. Here, there's another line here. So everything is pulling you in towards the center of interest there. Let's put the center of interest in blue. And that's the center of interest in general. But what is the overall center of interest? It is the feel and the mood of this landscape. What would it feel like to step into this pristine and beautiful location at this particular moment? What would that feel like? What emotions would you feel? What would resonate? And I think that's really clearly the center of interest. And then how is the image unified? Well, you can see that there's nothing in the painting that doesn't belong. These groups of trees here establish a pattern, which I'll talk about patterns later. You've got more trees along here. The light is very even and unique, even and unified through the image. And there's a nice division here between highlights on one side and shadows on the other side. And that gives you a very strong diagonal, which is always something that is very useful in composition. Right, so there's a really nice application of this LCU framework. Now in this image, I've also tried to apply the LCU framework. I'm not comparing myself to Albert Bierstadt in any way, but I do try to use the principles and learn from painters as best as possible. So you can see here that number one, I am using these rocks in the foreground to lead the eye into the image. Okay, starting at a diagonal. I've also got reflections here that lead your eye towards the distance. I've got clouds here, these clouds here moving you in. And of course, the center of interest, once again, is this bright area here with the warm light. Very similar to that last image. Probably subconsciously, I'm trying to duplicate what I see in these masterful paintings. So I'm leading the eye, I'm creating a strong center of interest, and then the image is unified because everything in the image feels as it belongs. The light is very even across the whole image, from shadows to highlights. There isn't anything that is getting very bright light or distracting light that is causing a high area of contrast that takes your eye away from where I'm leading you. Okay, I've purposely blurred the water by using a long exposure, 30 seconds perhaps. That again creates more interest between the rocks and the water and simplifies the water. It simplifies the clouds by smoothing them out, makes the image much more ethereal, much more dreamy, which was sort of my approach to this image. Okay, so again, trying to apply the LCU framework. Now let's look at an alternate version. This is one that I may have made slightly before, slightly after the one that I decided was the best version. And here I'm trying a different approach, trying to place the rocks in a different place, moving my camera a little bit left or right, or moving my tripod left and right. While this one is a nice image for many of the reasons that the last image is nice, I think, it doesn't quite work as well compositionally. And that's because I'm leading the viewer really in this direction. Okay, that's where I'm leading them, and it's pushing your eye up this way. And it's a stretch, I think, to want the viewer to return in this direction, because I think that the force of the lines is pushing you up in that direction. Now, that's not to say that this image wouldn't be a good image, but the other image is better because I think that it leads the viewer in a much simpler way that doesn't require, this sort of change of direction here. I think that the previous image just feels much simpler and much more directional. Compositionally, I think it's just a stronger image. And once again, referring back to the Edward Weston quote, it's the strongest way of seeing this particular scene. There's more water, less rocks. It allows your eye to move from foreground, middle ground, background. In this image here, it's almost as though the rocks have a little bit too much emphasis. I'm showing more of the rocks than I really want to. I just want the rocks to be there as a way to ground the image. Let's see how I've applied LCU here. I'm leading the viewer with very strong lines up in this direction along these rocks here. There are also some repeating elements here. And then leading lines as well, repeating elements and leading lines in the sky. And my center of interest really becomes the center of the image, so to speak, but it's the whole landscape that I want to emphasize. And the unity comes from the fact that the light is very even. Once again, all of the elements in the image are working together to emphasize the center of interest. Your eye can explore. You can go to these cliffs in the distance. You can explore the detail here in the foreground. But nonetheless, there isn't anything that is distracting or taking away. Everything feels as it belongs. The greens are all harmonious. They create a nice pattern. And so that's the idea between, once again, trying to apply the LCU framework. Are you leading the viewer? Is there a center of interest? And have you simplified the image enough to make it feel harmonious? Now, let me show you an alternate version here. And the main problem here is that while it's very similar, part of the problem is that the unity is really not as strong as it can be in the way it is in the first image. Number one, I'm creating a very direct or distinct accent here in the foreground. And while, that might be kind of interesting, and it's nice, light, nice golden light on that little leaf there. there's more light over here, there's more over here. And so to me, your eye wants to remain in this area. And the lines leading you into the image from foreground to background aren't quite as strong as the previous image. Once again, I'm comparing this image to the previous image. And I'm, when I'm shooting in the field, this is often what I will do. I will try different compositional ideas. And then later on, I can compare and contrast and see which really conveys what I want the image to be about. And in the previous image, again, it's much stronger. There's also this little corner here, which is distracting. You could say that this leads you in, but in fact, it really kind of pulls you down in this direction, which is not what I want. It's a very bright sunlit area surrounded by lots of shadow. So that's going to be an accent. And I just feel that that accent really prohibits the viewer or stops the viewer from wanting to go ahead and explore the background. You want to stay in the foreground because it has so much interest. And that's not really what I want. What I really want is to give an overall feel of the entire landscape. Again, what it's like for me, what it was like for me, what I felt, what my experience was. All right, so those are the basics, some basic ideas of how I use the LCU framework. It's something that you should definitely try to apply. Every time I make an image, I run through this little mental checklist. It's second nature now. But I think about, and I try to, when I look through my viewfinder, I'm constantly asking these questions. Am I leading the viewer? Are they good, strong lines? Is there a center of interest? Does everything belong, or is there something that feels as though it shouldn't be in the image or it doesn't have to be in the image? Can I remove it, and does it weaken or strengthen the composition? And that's how you start to slowly internalize this framework, this framework that I call the LCU framework. Now, the way to realize the LCU framework is by using the basic elements of visual design. I'm just going to give you these very basic elements. Of course, there's much more to this. There's much more to explore. As you learn these visual design elements, you can then begin to use them in different ways. But I just want to give you the foundation, because for me, everything begins with the foundation. If you understand the foundation, then it's much easier to know when or when not to use these design elements, and you have a good reason why not to use them. It'll give you a reason to break the rules, and you'll know why you're breaking the rules. But as a foundation, I think they're very worthwhile knowing and internalizing, making them second nature. So the basic visual design elements are lines, and lines can also be curves, straight lines, curved lines. Lines can be created through highlights and shadows, through the edges of something where there's an edge created through color or through light, or through things that have texture versus things that don't have texture. There are many different ways of creating a line. You can think of another way of thinking of a line is an edge. So, for example, the edge of a cloud with the blue sky in the background creates a line, and that line can be used compositionally. Shapes and masses are another really important visual design element. Shapes and masses almost always relate to actual objects in your composition. So, for example, a rock, a tree, a lake, things like that. They also will be formed by things that have common colors or large areas of commonality, texture, contrast, color, etc. So shapes and masses create a lot of visual weight in your image, and they will definitely determine where the eye looks and what calls for attention and what doesn't call for attention. Color is another important visual design element. Color will often create shapes and masses, or changes in color will create lines and edges. So color is very powerful when it comes to visual design, especially if you understand or learn how different colors react and work with one another. I think one of the things that a lot of photographers don't appreciate is the way in which colors work along the color wheel. So opposite colors contrast each other, red and green, for example, blue and yellow. Anytime you place these two colors next to each other, they create a very strong contrast. And often this contrast will either bring things forward or move things back in the composition. Texture is another one of those things that will create very strong elements in your composition that will call for attention or will pull the eye. Texture is also something that we all enjoy looking at. It's something that the eye finds very appealing to look at, and things in nature that we enjoy tend to have a lot of texture, tree bark and sand and so forth. And so texture is another important design element. And then finally, pattern. Pattern sets up repetitions, or repetitions create patterns, and patterns can be a great way to establish a larger mass or a larger shape. So if you have, for example, one tree or two trees, they will stand out. They will call for attention. But if you have a row of trees, 3, 5, 8, 10 trees, or a forest, now instead of you've established a pattern with these trees, and so now instead of it being a single tree, you've created a larger shape and a larger mass, and that mass will also have an edge that creates a line. And so you can see how these elements all start to work together and complement each other and can be used in many different ways. So I'm going to try to highlight here each of these elements by themselves. Part of that is difficult because I never use, or it's hard to use any of these elements without any of the others, but I'll show you where I've used one or the other as the driving factor in the composition. So in this particular example, I'm using lines to establish the composition. Why? Because this line here along the foreground sets up the whole composition. It leads the viewer in from the diagonal. And I'm going to start to talk about diagonals now, because the corners of your images, of your frame, are very, very important, because those create tension points. And anything that you put into the corner is going to call for a lot more attention than anything that is in these areas here. So notice how I've placed this very strong line right into the corner. This sort of edge here is in this corner. This cloud is in this corner. And then up here, it's really kind of open. I've already established the other three corners. But it's the line that I am using here to lead the viewer up from the bottom, and then the line gets repeated again along the river, and then finally there's a last line that takes you up here. So the line is really what I'm using to shape the whole composition. That's sort of the foundation of the whole image, and then everything else fits in. Of course, I've got texture in the foreground, less texture in the sky, and there's also texture along this line with the snow here. And the snow is what creates that really strong line. But line is the thing here that I'm using as the most important visual design element. Once again, talking about corners and diagonals. Here is my corner where I've started the image, and I've placed this very strong line right into this diagonal. The line continues up along here, along these edges, and then up into the sky. But the line here is really what leads the viewer in. Now they can sort of explore all these areas here, because I've created other interesting areas here with texture, which light and shadows. Notice that these other lines here are all coming into this diagonal. So I'm utilizing this other diagonal as well. And then there's repetition here in pattern, but it's line that is the main driving component of the composition. And then everything else, I've used whatever else I could also find in terms of the compositional elements. By the way, I've allowed the sky here to blow out, and I've placed that right on the edge. Why? Because first of all, look at the ratio of where the sky is. The sky is very high up in the frame, less than a quarter. And so while this is sort of, you could say that this might pull the eye out of the image, the huge foreground here with all the texture and the strong line here keeps the viewer, I think, grounded in the image. And so everything is relative in photography. That's why it's hard to apply formulas or rules, because it's all relative, one thing with another. And depending on how much of one thing you've used versus another thing, that's how you can determine whether it actually works or not and whether it's effective or not. Here's another image that was very difficult because of the strong light and contrast, but I've used lines as best as possible. The center of interest is the tree here. I mean, that really is what I'm sort of using to anchor the whole image, but I'm using lines along these rocks here. Okay, and these rocks here also create lines, more lines here, and slight lines here with the shadow. The lines help to lead the viewer and make it very clear where I want them to look and what is most important about the image. All right, so you can see here, line is the driving force, and then the other elements also play a role. For example, the texture in the foreground, light, of course, color. This is a silhouetted, so there's a strong contrast between lack of color and the beautiful golden color of the sunset back here. The other thing I'm going to mention now as well is that while I haven't mentioned the rule of thirds, I'm using that very clearly here. So there's the rule of thirds. I've placed the tree on a third. I've placed this other tree on the other third. I've placed the top of the distant mountain on a third, and then the bottom here is basically the base of this tree as a third as well. So the rule of thirds, we all know it, and it is cliche, but it works. It works for a reason. And so whenever I can use the rule of thirds in addition with the other visual design elements, I will, because as many different things you can use is going to help you make the strongest possible image. Let's talk about shapes and masses now. You can see here that line isn't really the driving element. I don't really have any clear, distinct lines, right? It's more about shapes. And so here's a big shape here, or a mass, you can call it. Here's another shape. Here's another shape. Here's another shape. Here's another shape. And I highlight these because these are the predominant shapes that lead your eye along here and then up there like that. And that's really where what I want the viewer to see. I want them to sort of look and feel the foreground and sort of imagine what it's like to stand on the edge of this ocean with the waves crashing in or rolling in. But at the same time, I also want to lead them up to the distant forest in the back, which is shrouded in fog, because it's the difference. It's that difference between the foggy area and the very sort of dramatic and deep foreground in terms of the color and the contrast and the weight, the visual weight of the foreground. That's the difference, that's the tension that I want to create. And so I'm using masses and these shapes. Plus the masses are interesting. They have lighter areas on top and darker on the bottom, so they have a lot of contrast, and that leads the eye again from dark to bright, dark to bright, dark to bright, dark to bright. All right, and so that again, it's sort of emphasizes the idea of dark in the image down here to bright in the image up here, and it's repeated in that pattern. But shapes and masses are the main design element that I've tried to utilize. You could say that there's a line that comes here from the bottom right along these rocks here and then leads you up this way. And that's the general direction that I want the viewer to follow. That is where I want to lead the viewer. But there's also another line here along the edge of this rock that leads you along here and again joins in with the other direction flowing here. So again, I'm using the two corners diagonally. Diagonal lines are always going to be much more dynamic than lines that are flat or vertical, diagonal lines. But it's the shapes themselves that create these lines. So here's one big shape leading to another big shape, leading to another big shape, and then smaller shapes up here. And I'm using these shapes in repetition to create the direction that I want the viewer to follow, and to create the interest from this area to this area here and up into the sky. Each of these shapes, by the way, has texture and interest within them. So for example, there are these beautiful shells here that are on this rock and over here as well. So those are areas that the viewer can explore, but there's no question that I don't want the viewer to linger or stay here that long. I am telling them that I want them to look from the foreground to the background. And again, creating depth, and that's another word that I haven't used too much, but I'm going to start to use more. Creating depth in your images is critically important, because we're creating two-dimensional objects on a three-dimensional, multi-dimensional experience using all five senses. Not only are you seeing the landscape in 3 dimensions, but you're also hearing it, you're feeling it, you're smelling it, you're even touching it. And so condensing that down to a photograph and trying to convey what you felt is really difficult. You're really removing a lot of the cues that we take in nature. So the more that you can do to sort of bring across all of those things that you experience in the landscape, the more powerful, the more communicative, the more successful, the more potential your image has to engage and resonate with the viewer. Here's another image where I'm using shapes and masses. Once again, there aren't any clear lines, but the larger shapes themselves lead you into the image. And notice you can start from here or from here because I'm trying to use diagonals. Once again, this one leads right to this rock and this one leads along the edge of this rock. And so the shapes and the masses here and the repetition lead you up to the larger shapes and masses in the background, and even the clouds here also become a part of the whole sort of repetition and pattern that I'm trying to establish here. So I'm leading the viewer through the use of these shapes. I'm establishing the center of interest here, and the image feels unified, back to LCU again, because the light is even, and there isn't anything in the image that doesn't feel as though it doesn't belong. I've tried to include as much as possible, but no more than that, to make the image simple, but still communicate what the context, what this landscape is all about. Color is another very powerful design element. Obviously doesn't apply if you're making black and white images, but if you like color like I do, you can use color very effectively. Here's a good example where if I had made this image in the summer so that the color of the leaves was all monochromatic or some sort of green, the image really wouldn't work. I mean, we'd still have these shapes that would sort of repeat, but it would be difficult for the viewer to be able to distinguish between all these shapes because they would all be green, all be basically the same color. But with this variation in color, I'm able to highlight each of these shapes. So this shape here is one particular color. This one here is another particular color. This one here is a different color, all slight variations in color, which allow me to anchor the image along the bottom right here, again, using the diagonal. And then this leads the viewer up through this area and through here up to the other diagonal. And I've also tried to create as much of a distinction here by leaving this area dark. There may have been another leaf over here someplace or some other colors here. I left those purposely out so that this edge would be dark. Therefore, again, making this area here the most important area. Part of the unifying of the image, making everything look as though it works and not having anything that is going to be a distraction or pull the eye away. Let's, for example, say that I would have had another orange or green or a yellow shape here that would have distracted, that would have pulled the eye away. Here, once again, there are some strong lines here, so I can't deny that line is one of the things that I'm basing the image on, but the lines create differences in color. And so this area here is one strong color. Here's another area here that's another strong color. It's very dark, and so that this darkness here makes this even richer and brighter and more saturated. Then I've got another big area here that lacks any color. It's mostly grays and light and dark blues. Then I've got the sky, and finally this last area up here, which is the blue sky, creates a nice sort of cap to the image. Not only that, but as I mentioned before, yellow and blue are opposite colors. They are complementary colors, and so they work well together. And so by placing the blue on top and the yellow on the bottom, I've created a very nice way to unify the image and make it feel as though everything belongs and the composition is just stronger that way. Now, I could have cropped or framed the image so that I didn't include the blue in the sky above those clouds there. In my opinion, that would have made the composition weaker. And so as I was framing this image, I backed off a little bit more and made sure that I got some blues on top, just enough to give a sense of context with the yellows on the bottom. Here's another image where I'm mostly relying on color. I'm in a forest in the fall once again. There's color everywhere, and I'm trying to make a very simple image about autumn, about the colors of fall. And pointing my camera down towards this lake with these branches just poking into my viewfinder, poking in front of my lens, I'm able to create a scene that has very interesting color, and the color is emphasized because it is surrounded by a lack of color. Once again, I'm using the rule of thirds here. I'm placing sort of the strongest mass of the leaves on a third there, and then I've got another third over here where I'm placing the shadows, or the reflections, I'm sorry, the reflections. So using the rule of thirds, but mostly relying on color and lack of color to emphasize the color, and then using these shapes here to create very simple composition. So while there's lots going on in the picture, very simple shapes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 there. Just simple shapes which help the eye to move through the image, and it just feels much more harmonious to me. This image is mostly about texture, the texture in the foreground, and then how the texture tends to recede into the distance because there's this fog rolling in, and the fog always takes away texture or color. And so that's how I'm able to create the depth in the images, by showing the difference between the foreground and the background through texture. Also through color, of course. Remember, I mentioned in the last image, yellow and blue, those two colors are complementary, and they are always going to create a lot of depth. They're going to separate things in an image. And so by placing, or by waiting for the fog to clear a little bit to give me some blue sky, I believe 5 minutes before I made this image, the background was just kind of a grayish fog, and that was very beautiful. But by waiting a little longer, as soon as some of that blue pokes in, that blue pushes the background further back, because blues and yellows are opposites on the color wheel, and so that creates separation. And by creating separation, I create an image that has more depth, that has more dimension to it, and that makes it feel just like it felt to me when I was there, that I could walk into this scene and just keep walking into the distance, not knowing what's going to come around these trees here. But the texture creates the interest. The texture creates the energy, the rhythm, so to speak. Okay, and then it diminishes when you get to this area here, and then finally goes away completely here. So again, I'm trying to maximize the variation throughout the image from top to bottom, and make it as interesting as possible. There's everything, every part of the image is working to create an energy from the foreground all the way to the background. Here's another image where I've placed a really strong line into the corner here. Here's another strong line into this corner. And then I'm using the rule of thirds, top of the sort of this area here, the top of the waterfall, the bottom of the waterfall is along another third. And then here is the center of interest, that's almost along a third. And here's my other third here with this other rock here that is sort of continuing this pattern here of moss. But it's the texture itself. That's the thing that I really wanted to emphasize. That's why I placed it so close to the viewer. Texture right here. And that's really what I want to emphasize and use as a way to ground the image. I want the viewer to start here first and to notice this and to get a sense of what it feels like to touch this wet moss that was right in front of me, that I touched as well. And then everything else in the image works to complement that. But I don't want them to stay here. The image is not about this mossy rock here. It's about the whole scene. What does it sound like at this waterfall? What does the waterfall sound like as it flows over the stream? What does it feel like to be there in the fall when it's a crisp 45 or 50 degrees? That's the whole idea behind the image. The light is very soft, and so that's what unifies the image, because I don't have bright sunlight over here or over here, which would cause a distraction, which would cause the eye to look and focus over here. I want the viewer to scan the whole scene, and to me, that helps them to get an overall feel of what the whole scene represents to me, and hopefully what I want them to take away, what I want them to feel. Here's another image where texture plays the most important role. Texture and lack of texture. And so in order for me to emphasize this texture here, I've also emphasized lots of areas that don't have texture, like the water here, and here, and here, and here. And again, that allows me to create these sweeping lines, these curves. But those are created through texture. And the idea here is to allow the texture to be interesting, but at the same time, I want the viewer to be able to see the water first and then the texture, or maybe vice versa. That option where the viewer has more than one way to see the image. Maybe they notice the water first, maybe they don't notice the water first. But the way to do that is to unify the image so that there isn't anything that doesn't feel like it doesn't belong. I don't have bright light coming in over here. I don't have a big log over here, so that would obviously call attention to itself. I want something that looks very uniform from top to bottom, but the texture is what I'm using here to create the pattern, to create the interest, and hopefully to bring a sense of the beauty of nature and how many different ways it can appear to us, and how many different forms it can take, from very dramatic to very lush to very almost abstract like it is here. Finally, pattern. Pattern is another one of those design elements that is very powerful, very subtle, and if used correctly can go a long way to simplifying your images. So here I'm using pattern to set up a pattern of trees. So there's this one tree here, and then I've got multiple trees back here and back here, and it's the variation in fog that creates the interest. Fog is one of those things where can be difficult to photograph. For me, the key is to photograph fog in transition, moving from one place to another. And so the fog is basically moved beyond this tree, which allows that tree to be fairly dark and obvious to the viewer. But because the fog is still shrouding the other trees in the background at varying amounts, that's what creates the interest. That's what creates I think the depth from front to back, because our eye perceives this as being further back and this one as being further forward. But it's the patterns of the trees that I'm most interested in, and how they change with the fog. Here's another example of using pattern. Once again, I've placed these strong silhouetted shapes into the corner so that the eye moves in this way, and then follows along here, and then along this fog bank, and then finally along this hard edge here and up into the sky. And the center of interest, probably in this area here, but once again, that's not really the thing I want them to see. I want them to feel, I want them to experience what it was like early morning on the Hudson River while the sun was coming up. And by silhouetting all of these leaves, it almost looks as though they're floating. It almost looks abstract in a way. And because I have captured them in lots and lots of patterns, they create larger shapes. So here's a larger shape created by all those, by the pattern of all the leaves. And then here's another shape here. And then here's a larger shape here, creating lots of repetition, lots of rhythm. And so that is basically how I'm using pattern here. Instead of one leaf or one leaf or one leaf, I'm trying to group them to create larger shapes that create easier ways for the viewer to kind of move through the image. They don't really, the viewer doesn't have to look at each individual leaf. They can just move from the foreground to the background. Once again, I'm using pattern. I've placed this tree into the corner, and then I'm using the repetition patterns of trees to create movement through the image, to make it unified. And it's, once again, the difference in the tone, the difference in the shapes, the difference in the color of these trees that keep you moving from front to back. And then this area here, which is also placed into the corner as a diagonal, pulls the eye in, because this is very light here, and your eyes always wants to go to areas that have stronger contrast. And so while the center of interest perhaps is back here somewhere, or that's where your eye is going to go, I've also made the trees in the foreground very, very distinct. And this is what creates a sense of depth and creates a sense of interest. And there's texture here, there's color, there's pattern and repetition, but it's the patterns of the trees that I want to create in a composition that allow the viewer to feel as though they can move through this forest from front to back, or if they were basically perhaps canoeing or moving through this stream, what would it feel like to go around that bend, the mystery of that, the sort of the wanting to explore. That's sort of what I'm trying to convey in this image. Let me offer 3 tips that I think can help you to improve your compositions. First, always consider all formats. A lot of photographers, a lot of students that I work with tend to get locked into shooting always in the horizontal format, and you can also shoot into the vertical format. And it's not a question of switching between the 2 formats with every image. It's a question of looking at the composition, looking at what's in front of you, and trying to decide whether a vertical or horizontal composition is going to make the image stronger. Where are the elements in your composition moving? Where is your eye moving naturally? Does it move left to right? Does it move up and down? Those things will help you to identify which format is going to convey exactly what you're seeing. Follow your eye, follow where you're looking and where you're scanning, and that'll give you a clue as to which format might be better for you. Second, does every element add to the composition? I've mentioned this before. I've also mentioned the phrase, what doesn't add detracts. But again, make sure that every single thing in the composition is adding to your overall composition. Everything in the frame is adding to the composition. Many times, you either consciously or subconsciously, we ignore things in the corners or things along the edge, or we don't see them, or we don't pay attention to them because we're so maybe attracted to something that is really strong in the picture. Remember, our brain can filter things out, but the camera doesn't filter anything out. The camera captures everything as it sees it. Our eyes do an amazing job, and our brain does an amazing job of getting rid of things that we don't want to see and not pay attention to. Camera doesn't. So make sure that everything adds. There's no such thing as a less distracting element. It's either distracting or it isn't. And finally, does the light support the entire composition? And I see this all the time, whether it's a lack of patience or whether it's not paying attention to the effect of that light can have on a composition. But light is the magic element. That's the glue that can either hold a composition together or can make it very, very weak because it's creating an area of interest that you don't want to be more interesting than your center of interest. So the light is really something you need to pay attention to, whether it means moving your camera or moving to a different location or returning to a location on a different day. If the light is not right, it doesn't matter what you do compositionally. It's just not going to be as strong of an image as it could be if the light was to your advantage. So let me show you a few examples of these tips. Here was my first attempt with this image. As many of us do, I started horizontally, thinking that was the way I wanted to. That's the way I would just start. But really, I felt right away that something was wrong, and the reason for that is because I was really paying attention to, or I was resonating with the height of these trees, with their sort of their stoic nature, and photographing them horizontally, I somehow lost some of that. Plus, in this image here, this tree dominates the whole picture, and it's not allowing the eye to sort of move into the background as I wanted. I wanted to create more sense of moving through the forest instead of just this one lone tree by itself. So I switched to vertical format and moved a little bit and placed the tree along the edge. And now I have a much stronger composition, at least in terms of what I'm trying to convey. Now I've got a sense of movement from foreground to background. And now the vertical nature of these trees that I mentioned before is much more evident, much stronger. It makes the image much more vertically oriented, creating a sense of the strength of these trees. What I needed to do here was get rid of these distractions. This really wasn't adding anything to the image. This was more distracting than anything else. So in my last attempt, I moved it a little bit tighter, just moved my tripod forward, and this is the final image here. So you can see now your eye moves along these rocks here to these trees, and then you flow into the back. And this texture here creates something that's interesting, something that the eye can explore, but there's no question that you're going to move back into the image. You're not going to stay stuck here. Okay, so that's an example where moving from horizontal to vertical changed my whole approach to composing the image. Here's another example. I started horizontally, again, thinking that would be the best approach, but there are a couple of problems here. Number one, the light here isn't helping me. It's actually creating a distracting element. your eye is going to be pulled to this bright area. And also I felt as though these boulders here were the ones that I really wanted to focus on, but there's too many distractions. These grasses here want to pull your eye away, and more trees here than I need, dark areas, just lots of ambiguity, so to speak. It isn't very clear where I want you to look. Do I want you to look here? Do I want you to look in this direction? Do I want you to just stay down here? Or do I want you to look at the far side of this river here with the bright sun? So I switched to vertical format. And now the image is much stronger. Now you can see I've placed a diagonal along on the top left that pulls your eye down. I've also got a line leading you in this way to the other rock and up here. And now you can see the image is much simpler. Instead of this pulling you out this way, this keeps you in this way because it creates barriers and borders and edges. And this element here creates the foreground. It creates a sense of depth of standing in this place, and then the masses repeat. There's also color along this edge here. So again, just from switching from a horizontal to a vertical format changed my whole approach to the composition and made me feel much better about what I was trying to achieve. And finally, one last one. Here's a composition where I thought that the light here was really beautiful and distinct, and I wanted to sort of push or create separation between the foreground and this midground here and the background, because you can see the change in color. I've also got light hitting these rocks in the foreground here, but it's almost too much. Yes, it's interesting. Yes, it looks nice, but it wants the viewer to remain down here. There's too much information down here in the foreground, and to me, it doesn't allow the viewer to explore through the image from front to back. So by removing those elements, simply zooming in a little tighter, I'm able to eliminate all this stuff that was down here. And now I've simplified the image to simple shapes. And these three shapes allow you to move into the middle ground and appreciate the background as well. So in this version, you can see here now that these cliffs here that are in the distance, much more interesting, much more apparent. I'm inviting you to look at those cliffs, and I'm setting this up as a foreground. And again, the change in color is also much more apparent, going from warm to cool, back to warm again. So that really creates a sense of depth and a sense of interest in the image. And remember, I mentioned before, warm colors come forward, cool colors recede. And so here, I think I'm really utilizing those colors and the change in temperature in a much stronger way. So as I said before, don't let the camera or the software or your impatience get ahead of striving for personal vision, right? Take your time when you're composing images. Use a tripod, because not only does a tripod give you usually better quality, but it slows you down and it allows you to analyze these concepts that I've talked about today, the LCU framework, and also, are you using all of the design elements as strongly and as simply as possible? You know, this allows you to give the viewer something to think about, not just something to see, right? So that wraps up this webinar. I hope it was helpful. Thanks again for watching and for supporting me, and watch for more webinars in the near future. Thanks. Take care.